Hey everybody, Thomas here. I just wanted to make a quick video talking about something that I've discovered in Toon Boom rather recently. As I'm sure you no doubt know if you pay any attention to my feed, I'm constantly post updates for this particular animation I'm doing for the Spongebob Rehydrated collab. Yeah, I just recently applied the shadows to King Neptune, as you can see here, and I had a bit of an experimental way of going about this. One that, looking back, it kind of makes me think I'm a little bit of a madman for even thinking of it. But, you know, it ended up working out very nicely, even though I've never done shading like this before, and I wanted to make this video because I thought it might be useful to any of my fellow animator friends who would want to try something like this to save time on shading. And I think it would just be an interesting piece of tidbit for anybody who's interested, because I love making like behind the scenes stuff for any of my animations. So with all that said, let's get into it. I'm going to be breaking down a lot of features in Toon Boom in order to explain all this. So yeah, bear with me. I'm hoping I explain everything in a way that makes sense. But with all that said, we got King Neptune here, looking stylish. Over here is what we call the node view. This is where we keep like all the drawings and different layers and stuff like that in a way that kind of looks like a net. It's very, very busy, but I promise I organize better in whenever I do professional work, not just a passion project. But anyways, here's King Neptune in the node view. I can turn him on and off like that, as you can see. And all the way over here are King Neptune's shadows. And as you can see, there are a lot of them. They aren't just one big thing, like this peg would have you believe. Instead, there's this shadow, and there's this shadow, and there's this shadow, and there's this shadow, and there's all these different shadows that all end up in different places as the animation goes on. They're all manually altered. They are all manually placed depending on what I need for that frame. And yeah, they're all also motion tweened, as I'll show you in a bit. So for those who aren't savvy to the differences between character rigged animation and hand-drawn animation, hand-drawn animation is when you literally draw every single frame individually, like I've done for King Neptune. But character-rigged animation is when you use things called deformers. What are deformers? Well, those are deformers. Those little green dots that just showed up. What those let me do is they let me manipulate the shape in all sorts of different ways. And in case you're not aware, this is not the actual shape of the shadow. The actual shape of the shadow looks like this. But by applying deformers to the build, as you see if I go into this thing here, I've put all these different points around the circle, and I can manipulate these points however I want, into any shape that I want. And the more points I add, the more malleable the shape becomes, which is very, very nifty. It makes it so that manipulating things like blobs and just things that kind of make very basic changes is a lot less of a pain. And because I have vector points like this, I can make it so rather than me manually placing the points all the time for every frame, like this, I can just let the computer do the work. So, if I delete all that and I hit Control K, look at that. The computer is figuring out for me where the points end up going. And I can control the timing of it a little bit by manually dragging and clicking in the timeline down here. And that makes it so it kind of follows along in a more natural arc, like that. And it follows along with the hand-drawn animation I did prior to this a little easier. So yeah, there's that. Oops, I think I went a little too far. There we go. So yeah, that's that. And now you might be wondering, why does it have all these vector points on the outside if I can only see it on the inside of King Neptune? The reason for that is because if I actually drag this over here to the main composite, you'll see that it actually looks like that big blob. It actually looks way bigger than it would appear in the final render. The reason it looks like this is because it's actually being cut by the shape of King Neptune. What that means is Toon Boom has these nifty little nodes called cutters that make it so that shapes that are affected by it can be cut by another shape, and it can be cut in two different ways, as I'll show you in a bit here. Let's use this one as an example. Yeah, I have a lot of colors here, as you can clearly see, so it'll take a bit of explaining, but what's an easier way to show off King Neptune? Okay, well, why don't we just do this? So if I drag in a cutter here and I just apply it to King Neptune for a sec, and this part on the left side here, let's say I plug Mr. Krabs into that. So check out what's happening there. I don't know if that made a visible difference, but you'll notice that here. I might have to pick something that's behind it actually. But yeah, like essentially what's happening is Mr. Krabs is cutting the King Neptune shape in such a way where the King Neptune shape will not show up around here no matter what. In fact, I have the perfect frame to demonstrate that. At the very end here. You see how when I turn this off, King Neptune is overlapping Mr. Krabs there, but when I turn it on, he's not anymore. So that's what the cutter does in the basic position, but I can also flip it. And what that does is it makes it so King Neptune does not appear until he's overlapping Mr. Krabs. And there's all sorts of possibilities you can do with this, but I'll show you the main purpose of this for when it comes to the shadows that I put into this scene. Let's get rid of that. Save real quick. Ooh, I just spotted a little error there. I'll have to remember to fix that. But anyways, yeah. So essentially, the way I use cutters for all the shadows is all these blobs are being cut in the reverse way by King Neptune's shape, so they don't appear unless they're on the inside of King Neptune, essentially. And that's not even the full extent of it. So this very, very messy view here, I'll explain why this looks so daunting in a second. So essentially what I've done is I've plugged the same shadow here multiple times into the scene. And there's a big reason for that. I didn't want this shadow to just be the same color regardless of what part of King Neptune he's over, because the default color for the shadow is like this really dark green, right? In fact, fun fact, it's the same color I use for their drop shadows. But I don't want it to always be dark green, no matter what part of the of King Neptune it's overlapping. So essentially, what I've done is I plugged it in multiple times, and every time it's plugged in, it's cut by a different part of King Neptune. So, for instance, right here, I have a color, what's called a color override over here. And what this does is, for this section of King Neptune, the only part that's appearing is the skin. And when I plug this into the inward cutter, what that does is it makes it so this part of the shadow, it only appears in the sections where King Neptune's skin appears. And you can see that highlighted like that. Whereas if I turn it off, it completely overlaps the arm and everything. So I turn it on, boom. It only appears on the parts where his flesh color appears. But that's not the only extent I take it. You'll notice another color override beneath this cut. And essentially what this one does is, rather than make it so it only a certain color appears, this can make it so I can make one color appear as a different color. So this makes it so my default shadow color turns into a different kind of dark green. It's more like a light bluish green that's just slightly lighter than the skin color, if that makes any sense. So that makes it so it's that color, whereas if I were to turn this off, it's a much darker green. You see that? And I've repeated this process for every color for almost every color in King Neptune's palette. So for instance, the white, you see how it's like a light gray? If I turn this off, it's a dark green, just like the default shadow color. If I look at the gold here, I made that into a dark yellow. If I turn that off, it's a dark green again. And I did this for so on and so forth. And the color changes depending on what part of his body the shadow is overlapping. I really wanted to do this because you may have seen in a lot of shows, the shadowing is very basic. It's just dark, it's just black, a transparent black for all the limbs. And it kind of looks boring and also kind of muddy. Whereas, in my opinion, shading generally looks better when the shadow is just a darker color of whatever it's overlapping. And what I've essentially achieved here is I've made it interact in such a way where, regardless of what part it's overlapping, it will always be just a darker shade of that. And it will always change depending on what I do. So if I take this point and I drag it up here, it's not the dark green anymore. It becomes the dark white, essentially. Becomes very, very handy, and it saves a lot of time with just a little bit of setup in the beginning. So yeah, and I've done this for every single shadow. Every single shadow in King Neptune's build here. They are all formatted in exactly the same way. And sometimes I put them completely off screen in case I don't need them for that specific frame. But anyways, so yeah, after all that, I plug them all into here, into this main composite, and I apply different filters. The transparency, which it's very self-explanatory. It makes everything transparent, whereas if I were to turn it off, boom, it's solid colors now. Doesn't look very appealing at all. And the blur, which is also self-explanatory. It's very blurry now. If I turn it off, it looks solid now, which doesn't look too bad, honestly, but I prefer the blur. I would turn it on. Now it has that nice kind of gradient feel to it. And you can manipulate these any way you want, by the way. I can make it blurrier. I can make it more transparent if I want. But for now, I think the way I had it before looks best. Save all that. And you might be wondering, why don't I just put a transparency on all the different shadows? The problem with formatting it that way is that if they all have their own transparency to them, it overlaps in a weird way. Because these shadows tend to overlap each other. And if you're not careful with how you adjust these, they will overlap and they'll create this weird, slightly darker blot in the center. I'll see if I can demonstrate real quick. So there's that, and where's the other one? There. That's not it. There we go. So if I put that transparency there, and I make it like a weird thing, like 60. Oh, okay, bad example. Sorry. Oh, maybe if I make it lower, actually. And if I turn this off, just to demonstrate. And give that its own transparency. Okay, yes, so this is what I was talking about. So these two shadows are overlapping, and you can clearly see that they're overlapping because this midpoint is much darker than the rest. Doesn't give a very good look in my opinion. So yeah, that's generally what I like to avoid. Let's undo all that. And yeah, so you got to be careful. You want to plug them all into the same composite before you apply the transparency and blur. And then finally, I put one more cutter down here, but this one isn't inverse. It's the regular kind of cutter. And the color right over here, this is singling out the line work. Of King Neptune. So just the black that's used for all of his outlines. And that makes it so that the shadows never overlap the black of the line work. And I'll see if I can turn that off. So you see if there's much of a difference. Oh, it actually doesn't matter that much in this instance. But yeah, generally speaking, it makes it so that you can make it so that the shadows never really overlap the black by accident. And that might be handy depending on how you play with the shadows. I'm starting to think it might not be necessary here, but that's fine. That's essentially what it's supposed to do. You know what? Maybe if I, instead of this, I put a line art here instead. Let's see if that makes a difference. Yeah, you see that? So that makes it so that the shadows never overlap the line art. I'm going to make it that way instead, actually. So, yeah, and I'm able to achieve that, by the way, because another fun fact about King Neptune, well, I zoom out and re-find him here. Ugh, hang on. It's not properly selecting the color, or the drawing, rather. So, I have two layers here. There's the line art for King Neptune and the color art for King Neptune. That makes it so only the colors appear and not the outlines. And honestly, I think that looks pretty slick. But yeah, that makes it so that I can easily cut using the line art or the color art instead. But yeah, that's basically the gist of what I've achieved here. If any of my animator friends are watching, maybe this gave you some ideas on how to do shading in the future. For what it's worth, this took me maybe like 5 or 6 hours to do the shading this way. And it ended up being much more time-saving than the alternative, which is doing the shadows frame by frame too. So definitely consider it. I hope you find it useful, and yeah, I hope you found this interesting, even if you're not an animator. All right, have a great day, everyone. Peace.